Hey team, Mr. Coop here. Today we are going to talk about how to get a nice looking cutting board together. So there's two main things you got to do before you start any cutting board. One, you got to decide what style you like and what woods you're going to use, right? So style is partly about what woods you're going to use because that'll determine the kind of colors that come out in the woods that you use. So we certainly need to decide the types of wood, and then we need to decide how much of each one and in what place. So everyone's going to have a different looking cutting board. I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate one, pretty basic one with a bunch of vertical stripes. But there are a large variety of different types of cutting boards you can do out there, and there are a lot of videos showing you that. But my hope is that this video is going to help you understand what tools you should use and when, and how to do a proper glue up on a cutting board, and all the different ways that you might finish it out, both in your sanding techniques and the way that you apply the oils and different things. All right, that's where we're headed. So first thing, got to get ourselves a plan. I have three different woods that I'm hoping to use in mine. I have a little bit of cherry, walnut, and then I'm going to have some accent pieces out of this Aframasia because it's a little bit more expensive, harder to come by, and I prefer it to just be an accent piece. So that's what we're going to do, and now check out my plan. Alright, so here I've got the basics of my plan, and what I'm going for is mostly walnut with a little stripe of cherry and having those flanked by Aframasia on either side. Now my measurements currently, they add up to exactly 10 inches if you were to add it all together. What I want to do is actually probably make my walnut pieces about 1/16 of an inch big each, so that I'm a little larger than 10. In case something goes wrong, then I have 10 1/4. I can, if something gets out of square, I have room, and I can take a little extra off. So I'm gonna make those 2 1/16. So now I'm gonna go to my cut list and make that. Okay, now I've created my cut list here. So I'll have 4 pieces at 2 1/16 of walnut. Cherry, I'm going to have 1 at 1 1/4. And then Afro, which is short for Aframasia, for 2 reasons. One, it's a lot to write it, and I probably don't actually know how to spell it. So 2 of those at 3/8 of an inch. So once you have a good plan, this is when you're going to have to make sure that you approve it with your teacher, that it looks good. Oh my, I didn't even write all the lengths, but this is 14, and we're going to cut these rough to 14 1/2 at first, so that when we need to cut a little off of each end, we have some room. Okay, so let's grab our material and let's get our rough cuts. All right, friends, well, as you can tell, I'm getting geared up. I have my safety glasses and my ear protection ready because the next step is going to be starting to cut some of these things. Well, my plan, as you already saw, required me to have 4 walnut pieces. Notice I've got my plan with me. Not a bad plan for you as well. I know I need 4 pieces of walnut at 2 1/16 inches, okay? So that can mean that you have, by 14 1/2 inches long. So you could have a 14 1/2 inch long piece and cut 4 pieces out of it, right? Maybe you do that. Maybe you multiply 14 1/2 times 4 and you find out how long that is, and you do 1 long rip cut on that walnut, and then you cut it up into 4 sections, right? So depending on what materials are available to you, you need to make sure you resource that well and that you are not wasting a lot of material as you do that. For instance, if you need only 14.5 inches, you don't want to take an 8-foot long stick and run the whole thing for one piece and then cut it off, and then someone else is left with that chunk there, the rest of that 6.5 feet or more of the same width dimension that you had. They may not want it that wide. They might need it wider, right? So be careful how you use your material. Most of the time your teachers are going to help you get that. So for me, I happen to have this material available that was just a little bit longer than 14.5 times 2. These are 30 inches more or less of my cherry and of my walnut and of my Aframasia. Now, remember, with my cherry, I actually only have one piece, so I might, in this particular occasion, since it's already only 30 inches, I might be okay to just rip the whole thing, give my buddy a piece if they're doing the same type of cutting board, or I can try and find a smaller chunk, okay? Depending on how long the board is, we might have you cut off 14.5 inches and then just run that part through, okay? So, I have my cherry, I have my walnut, and the walnuts will get, so 2 out of each one, right? Because 14.5 here, 14.5 there, 14.5 here, 14.5 there. So this board will be enough for my whole piece. And then my Aframasia, I'm just taking off a little bit, and I'm going to teach you a technique for cutting off small pieces on a bandsaw if that's what you are doing, which is probably a junior high technique. Now, I'm going to show you how to do this on the bandsaw and then use the planer, but if you are in high school and you're watching this video, you very well know that you can use a table saw to make the same kind of cut, and just make sure you leave a little extra if you feel like you're going to need to plane your pieces down after you have ripped them, okay? Just as we'll do here on the bandsaw. Alright, so whether you're using a bandsaw or a table saw, come here, set your measurement, and we're going to get going. So I'm going to start with my walnut, and like I said, especially with the bandsaw, it leaves a lot of curves on it. So that like little saw marks that you want to make smooth, because if you glue together something that has a bunch of saw marks, there's going to be gaps galore, and then guess what? You're cutting your yummy steak tartare. Oh wait, why would you cut that? I don't know. Anyway, juices from whatever you're cooking are going to seep into those, and then you're going to have festering, rotting, yucky. Don't want that. We want tight seams so it looks good and it's healthier, safer, you're not going to get sick. Alright? So here we go. I'm going to set this up. My number I want to get to is 2 1/16, so I'm going to cut mine to 2 1/8, maybe 2 3/16, so that when I go over to my planer, I can take off those rough edges and make it nice and smooth. Ready? Here we go. Guess what, everybody? My first piece had a nice straight edge on it, but my cherry does not. So we're going to take the cherry over to the fez tool and get a straight edge on it. Those who are in high school, you know that you might have the planer available to you. Jointer. You have the jointer available to you, and you can get yourself one straight edge by going to the jointer. So if you have a joiner, go there. If not, like me, head over. After I plane my piece, after I cut a straight edge, I like to just give myself a reminder mark. This is the edge we want to have against the fence. So, you always need to have a straight edge against the fence. So remember I told you I'd give you a little hint? If you have a piece that is, unfortunately, or that you want to cut pretty small and the fence is hitting the bearings or this part of the safety, then what you can do is utilize another perfectly parallel piece, so one that has a parallel dimension all the way through, like the piece I just cut of cherry. Then you use that and you measure from where the cherry is against the fence to the blade and get your measurement. Now, I want my Afromosha to be 3/8 of an inch, but not yet. So I set it to almost 1/2 inch so that I can go to the planer and smooth off my rough edges. So 1/2 inch from there to there, then I'll be able to take off a 1/16 on either side and make it smooth on the planer, and then we'll go from there. All right, so let's do this. All right, got 2 sticks of walnut. Oh wait, we need 4, that's right. We'll do our cutting these in half after we plane them. I have 1 stick of cherry, that's all I need. And I have 1 stick of Afromosha that's long enough to get 2 out of it as well. So, I've got my pieces. Let's plane them down and get them to the right width that they need to be. And it'd be nice to have them at the same thickness so that when we glue it and we use our cawls, it all clamps together really nice. Okay? Alright, so here we are at the planer. What I like to do is start out with my widest, or the pieces that need to be the widest. So that's my walnut. They're at about 2 3/16 right now. We want to get them down to 2 1/16. And then if we want to, I can probably take my innermost ones and get them all the way to 2, so that if I shave any off, it's on the outside. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up. Right here is my depth gauge, depth of cut gauge, which you would have learned about. You want to set that to the dimension here that you had. So since I said I'm at about 2 3/16, I'm going to set it to 2 3/16, and we're going to run it through on a pass like that, right? Then also with this, if you have a really tall piece by itself, it's going to want to maybe lean over and not get quite as square. So you want to run, if you have 2 pieces like this, it's nice to run them side by side and hold them as you enter and try and keep them nice and flat, okay? If you have a smoother side that's already square, run that side down first so that the side on the top is also going to turn out square. Right. So here we go. I've set it to 2 3/16, and watch as I run these through. All right, students, so now you've got your pieces planed down for thickness, and you've got them nice and smooth, but they're still twice as long as they need to be, or depending on what your cuts are, maybe it's 4 times as long, and you need to cut these to length. Okay, it's possible that when you ran them through the planer, they were already to the length that they needed to be, but I'm guessing a lot of people will need to cut them down. So you can either use one of 3 tools that I can think of. Maybe some shops have other ones, but here's one of your options. If you're at the junior high, I think there's a few junior highs that might have this set up. There's a crosscut saw, and that's available for you. Or a lot of schools have one of these, right? You got your compound sliding miter saw or chop saw, something of that nature. But today, one of the simplest ways to do it is just with a handsaw, because it's still a rough length. So head with me, we're gonna go get that handsaw out, and we're gonna get these cut to rough lengths. So my pieces were twice as long as they need to be. I need to get to a total of 14 inches at the end of the day, but I'm cutting to 14.5 so that I have a little extra room once I've glued it together to cut both ends perfectly square. All right? So what that means is I'm gonna grab my tape measure and measure and mark each of my pieces and check. If you do 14.5 and then you measure from the other direction and you have 13 and something, that's not gonna work. So make sure you have enough on both cuts. It's best to maybe cut right in the middle, and hopefully you got these rough lengths good. So watch, I'm gonna make my marks and then I'm gonna cut these in half, and then we're gonna set them together and do a dry fit before we go to glue. All right, so I have made all my cuts. So I'm gonna make sure I put away the saw. Very important detail. After you get all the cuts done, and it looks something like this, and you've got it laid out, there's a really important piece of layout that you need to do. You need to make sure that there is an alternating pattern on the grain. So right now, if I was to keep these two together like this, that would cause this to potentially warp in that direction and not remain flat. So what we need to do is flip it so that the grain directions are opposite. See the curves on this one going up that way. On this one, they're going down that way. That's what we need, so that they counteract each other and cause our board to stay flat. So check each one. That one's going that way, that one's going that way. Once you get the alternating grains so that's so they're working against each other and keeping each other flat, then you got to make sure that there are no gaps. So we're gonna take this over to the glue table or wherever you use your clamps. We're gonna clamp it together and make sure there's no gaps anywhere between any of our pieces. And if there are no gaps, that's when we're ready to glue up. So let's go check it out. All right, team, well, I transported these over here and I made a mistake. I had already gotten them all lined up, and then I transported them over and I was like, oh shoot, I have to reorient the grain. One good idea is that once you get them organized, maybe write on them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the faces so that you don't lose track of them. I've written a little number on there. It's not easy to see. Another thing you can do is just draw a giant triangle across them so that they should match up when you go to glue them again. A few things we're going to learn. 1, clamps. If you have clamps like these at your shop, they're called case clamps. One thing is we want to protect our clamps from glue. So one thing we can use is tape on here. Other people might put plastic. I find tape to be pretty easy. There's actually some tape already on here from a different project, it looks like. But what I do is I size this up, and I only put the tape from just before the last seam. So if I press this end tight to this piece of wood, then right before that last seam, if I put my tape to there, then as this closes in on it, it does not bind on the tape. So I'll do that real quick. I'll put it in fast mode for you. Now that I've got the tape on those, I'm going to actually slide them under here. Easier said than done. I clamp my boards, set it on there, and you know what? I'm going to go ahead and tighten it. So the nice thing about this style of clamp is that it's going to hold your pieces together just pretty flat on the bottom. Now, that does not mean that we should not also use what are called cawls. And you should have seen that in your slide deck. A cawl is when you take a flat piece of wood like this, and we will clamp this here to make sure these boards all stay flat. Okay? But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. First, we're going to clamp this tight without glue and make sure that there are no seams anywhere, which there shouldn't be because we ran them through the planer on their edges. Or for some of you guys that are at the high school, if you did a really good job on your table saw, then you shouldn't have any seams. Like right here, you can tell that board and that board, there's a seam there, but there's no gap. Okay. Same with these. That light dark spot is just unevenness, so I need to use my cawls to get that flat. And you see gaps like this one. Okay. If you see gaps like this one, that's pretty small, but it matters. Okay. This is a small gap. Let me show you another example. Okay, these are large gaps. These are pretty unacceptable gaps right here. You don't want that. You definitely need a straight edge on that. And again here. So this is clearly not a straight piece, right? So we want to make sure we avoid any of that. We make sure that our glue up is nice without the glue, and then we can go ahead and get ready for our glue up. So we have tape on the bottom of these. Great. But like I said, we're going to put these cawls on here. But if there's glue coming out of all those seams, and then we put these on with no barrier between this piece and that, you're going to have these cawls stuck to your board. We don't want that. What I'm going to do on this, on the cawl, this is my favorite thing to do, is actually wrap it in plastic. So set that down, wrap it in plastic. I had something going on wrong here. I like to have the handles towards the inside of the table so it's not going to jab anyone. Then you got to open them up a little bit. Once you've checked, you know all your pieces are good, your clamps have tape on them, your cauls are ready, it's time to go. So, since I have 4 pieces here and 3 pieces here, I like to kind of split up the gluing. And depending on how good you are at balance, we can kind of work at this. But I like to do it where you flip one up, you glue an edge, keep track of it, make sure that the numbers all stay to the one side. Glue, glue, stack. And then I'm going to do the other side as well. I'm going to start with the smaller side because it's less likely to tip. And this is the way to try and keep as much glue off the table as possible. So just about a spaghetti's the width of a spaghetti, more or less. And then I'm going to flip this way. Take your finger, spread it out, try and get it out on there evenly towards the edges. All right. And stack them. Now I'm not going to show you the rest. I'm not going to do the rest slow. You're going to see it fast now. Here we go. Alright, now I've got all the pieces glued, and I'm going to try and make one side pretty nice, and I'm choosing this side because this has a rough end on it that I certainly want to get cut off. And you might get some glue on your fingers. I like to just rub it and get it dried off. But don't spend too much time on this. It's nice to have a wet cloth next to you if you can. Luckily, I did a really fast job on the glue up and it's still wet. But these glue ups need to happen pretty fast. So now I'm going to compress this clamp, get them lined up. And I'm also kind of pressing them down against the clamp so that it remains pretty straight. Alright, they're wanting to move a little bit, but they're well within reason. We have that ½ inch of play, so should be good. And you want to see this happen. The glue should come out everywhere along the whole strip. Not too much, just a little bit, but definitely a little bit so that you know it's tight. Okay? Now I'm going to do something I really like to do, which is scrape up my excess glue before I put the cauls on. I like to use a little wedge like this. And I just come with the wedge and maybe a scrap piece of wood, or grab something out of the trash that's going to get thrown away anyway. And I come like this. And then I just wipe it on there. Okay. My board is sufficiently clamped in all directions. You can double check and twist them all. At this stage, if you want to get a wet rag and get the last little bits of glue, that works. We're going to let this dry up and come back tomorrow, and we'll start chipping away the glue and put it through the planer to get it looking nice. All right, here we are, bright morning sunlight the next day, and I had my cutting board all glued up. I'm gonna set it down, and we're gonna just unclamp. Now, do we leave our clamps here or do we put them away? So now we've got this thing out of the clamps, and there's kind of some nasty glue all over it, but I did a pretty good job cleaning it up especially under where the clamp is. It's hard to always get that. So now we're going to scrape that off, and then we're going to head to the planer and get rid of most of it. After that, we'll square up our edges, get our dimensions correct, and we'll move into sanding and buffing. I've scraped off most of the excess glue. I have one spot right here I still want to hit, because the smoother this is, the easier it will run through the planer and it won't get bound up. So you don't need to have all the glue gone, but you don't want to have any big chunks. So I have about one more here that I got to deal with, then we're going to the planer. You're going to want to choose your smoother side and have it down first, because the rollers will grab it and pull it better. And then once you get one side perfectly smooth and there are no places where your fingernail catches, that means that you are smooth on one face. Then you can flip it over and do the other one. Make sure you look as you plane it to see if there's any chip out because of the grain direction. If so, you should turn this thing 180 degrees on your next pass, and it should make those little pock marks go away. All right, you don't want to get this thing too thin, so make sure you only take off the amount that you need to. All right, here we go. Passes the fingernail test. So now we just have to cut this thing to width, if it's not perfect already, and length. We'll start with the length. Alright, so again, on this particular task, you could use a compound sliding miter saw or chop saw or radial arm saw. There's another safe way to do it, and that is with a table saw using a sled like this for crosscuts. So I've got my piece set up where the rougher ends, I made it so I'm just going to cut it clean, and then I'll make my measurement and get it to exactly 14 on the other side. So watch as I make my clean cut, and then I'll measure and get an exact 14 inch. Safety equipment on. Now I still have to take this down a bit on either side. So this can be done on the bandsaw or table saw, and then cleaned up with your jack plane or sanders. Make sure as you set this up that you plan to do equal on either side. I'm at 12 1/4, so I need to go down 1/8 inch on either side. Okay, now I've got it to my exact width and length. It's time to start sanding and then putting a detail on it. Okay, students, so proper order of operations after you've got it cut to length and width. You want to make sure your edges are smooth, okay? And when you've got them all smooth, then you want to come here to the router and put the detail on it if you're going to do a detail. If you're just doing a very light sand, that's okay. This one's set up with the roundover. You always want to start with the end grain first, then go to your edge grain. Alright? So start with an end grain, you can wrap all the way around. And after you wet your material, after having sanded to 150, then you'll get your 220 on, and this will be your final sanding. I suppose that does depend on what kind of material you have, but generally speaking, 220 should be enough for cutting boards. If you wanted to go to 400, you could, but 220 should be sufficient to get all the scratches, visible scratches out. Now your shop may have a different type of oil finish. Here we'll use this one, and it's pretty easy because it's just a wipe on, let it sit, and buff off situation. So it's looking pretty good. Now I'm just gonna let that rest, and tomorrow I can come back and buff that out. So that's the process, you guys, of building the cutting board. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're proud of what you created.